In this lesson, we'll begin learning how to implement a proper linear workflow when rendering with Mental Ray inside of Maya. Okay, great. So if you want to go ahead and open up the same file that I'm looking at now, this will be your Lesson 8 Begin file. And now that we're familiar with color space, remember in the last lesson we learned about both the linear and the sRGB color space. What we can do here is we can come in and just simply render the current frame here. This particular scene is set up in such a way that this could very well be the first render you've taken after you've come in and set up all your materials. Now, after your lighting has been created and your materials have been created and applied, if you render this scene out and get this result, you know based on what we discussed in the last lesson that the result that we see here is not correct. We've got some things wrong with this rendered result. If you remember in the last lesson, we talked a little bit about the lighting inside of Maya existing in a linear color space. That means the lighting has a gamma response curve of 1.0 applied. Now our textures and our materials, those guys exist in an sRGB color space. So they have that gamma response curve of 2.2 applied. Let me just go ahead and show you this image again here, this image we looked at in the previous lesson. This is kind of the step that we're at right now, this step here. Now let's talk a little bit about how we could begin to fix that. So now in fixing that, here inside the render view, we do have this new feature inside of Maya 2015 right up here. It's a gamma slider. And you can see that by default it has a value of 1 put into it. Again, a linear color space. So if we wanted to, we could come in here and we could adjust that gamma slider to a value of 2.2. And you can see here that now our render looks very similar to that second image, this guy right here. But again, remember, there's still a problem here, because while we have fixed the lighting and the amount of gamma that's applied to it, so it has a gamma response curve of 2.2 applied, we've essentially doubled the amount of gamma that's being applied to our materials. And thus, if we come back over here and look, you can see all of the textures and really the materials applied to anything inside of our render looks very, very washed out. Now, this slider is a handy little feature that has been added to Maya for previewing gamma adjustments, but it's not a fail-safe way to always make sure that you have a gamma response curve of 2.2 applied to what you're seeing inside of the render view. Let me just point that out. Let me just close out of my render view and reopen it. And you can see here that that setting goes back to its default value. Now, if we wanted to, we could also reset that back to its default at any time just simply by clicking on that little icon next to it. But if we wanted to make sure that we have a gamma response curve of 2.2 applied each and every time to what we're seeing inside of our render view, then we need to go about this a little bit differently. Let me go ahead and show you this. This will also apply to people who maybe are using a previous version of Maya before this was added in Maya 2015. You could come over here to your display menu, and if you come down to color management here, you'll notice what happens. Something opened up behind my render view. I'll just shrink this guy down a bit. You can see this default view color manager has opened up. Now basically what this is looking at here is the data that's coming into the render view as a result of the rendering process. That's what this image color profile is. So it's looking at that and it's saying, okay, I'm anticipating sRGB encoded data that's coming in, and then I'm going to display that back in the render view as sRGB data. And that's getting us this result here. Now we already determined that our lighting exists in a linear color space. So watch what happens if I come in here and just switch my my image color profile over to linear sRGB. You can see here we get the exact same result. Now, this is really a better place to make this change if you want to constantly have that amount of gamma applied to this data coming into your render view, because I can close out of my render view and reopen it. And you can see here that, again, that is a persistent change. Now, we do have a problem here. Remember, our materials, they have the wrong amount of gamma applied to them here because of the fact that basically they already existed in an sRGB color space. they already had that gamma response curve of 2.2 applied. So by doing this, we are applying another gamma response curve of 2.2 to those materials. And as a result, they look very washed out. Now, how do we begin to fix this here inside of Maya? Well, there is a feature called color management that we can get to through our render settings. Let me come over here, and I'm just going to open the render settings. And if I come over on the Common tab, you'll see the very first thing we see is color management. Let's go ahead and turn that on here. Now, just turning that on is not going to change anything right now in our render view because we took this render before we enabled color management. But let's talk for a moment about what's going to happen here, this default input profile and this default output profile. So basically, this default input profile is tied directly to the materials in our scene. It's basically looking at the color space that those materials exist in. And if we have this set to sRGB, like it should be, then we can set our default output profile to linear sRGB. And that's going to output these guys in a linear color space. We know that our lighting exists in a linear color space, so we want to equalize the amount of gamma that's applied to both the lighting and the materials. So by setting this default output profile to a linear sRGB, basically we are applying the same amount of gamma to our materials that's being applied to our lighting, and thus equalizing it. Again, if I bring up that image we looked at in the last lesson, you can see basically what we're taking it is from this step here to this step here. So we're going to apply a gamma response curve of 1 to both. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and with those two marked, I'm going to go ahead and re-render this. But keep in mind, we made a change back here. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But let me just go ahead and re-render this current frame. All right, fantastic. So when this comes back, the first thing you should notice is that no longer do we have washed out materials here. We have equalized the amount of gamma that's applied to the lighting to the amount of gamma that is applied to the materials. We also don't have any more of those really hyper blown out highlights and really dark inky shadows. As a matter of fact, you can actually see we have some detail in the shadows now, which is exactly what we would anticipate having. So if your image doesn't look like this one, if your whole image looks relatively dark, then you might check to make sure that you made this change a moment ago that we made. Now, if we didn't make this change right here, let me show you what we would see. We would see something like this. Now again, referring back to that image we looked at in the previous lesson, this is basically the equivalent of what we just looked at. So basically, if we come over here and change this image color profile from sRGB to linear, Maya knows that the color space that the data is in that's coming into the render view is linear, but it's going to display that to us in sRGB. Okay, fantastic. Now what else does this mean? Well, if we come over to our render settings, keep in mind that we have our default output profile set to linear sRGB. The output profile, you could think of sort of a connection between that output profile and this over here, this image color profile right here. Because we're displaying a linear color space as our output profile, that means that the images we save are going to have that gamma response curve of 1.0 applied. Now, we can't just save a linear image into any particular image format. Only 32-bit images can support a linear color space. So that means that if you plan on outputting this as maybe an HDR image or an EXR or even a 32-bit TIFF, that would be great. But if you wanted to send out, say, a JPEG of this render, it's not going to look right because it's going to have the wrong gamma encoding applied to it. So what if we needed to do that? What if we wanted to render some maybe just JPEGs or 8-bit TIFFs or something like that that exist in an sRGB color space? Well, in order to do that, we need to change this guy right here. So we'll go ahead and switch my output profile to sRGB. I'll close that out. And I'm going to save this image for comparison. We'll just go ahead and re-render. And when that render completes, oh no, look, we broke our render again. No, not really. We're just basically looking at our render wrong. Again, because we made this change. Remember, this image color profile here really is directly connected to our default output profile. And now the fact that they don't match up is creating kind of a problem here. So if we switch that back to sRGB, again, we are perfectly fine at this point. We can now come into our file menu and choose to save this particular image. Maybe if we're batch rendering or maybe rendering out multiple frames, we can do that. But again, with this setup here, we're outputting sRGB encoded files. So again, you could use any file format you want with this particular output. But if you're working as part of a production pipeline with maybe a compositing step that would follow your rendering phase, then you might check with your compositor, because most compositors would prefer to have a linear color space render from their rendering artist. They will typically prefer to apply that gamma encoding at the compositing step. So in that case, again, you might want to come back in and change your default output profile to linear. And again, remember, just so it looks correct on your screen, you'll need to jump back over to your default view color manager and change that image color profile back to linear. All right, great. So everything should be good to go, right? I mean, we've come in and we've changed all of our settings inside the render settings. We've adjusted things over here. Well, not entirely. There is some additional steps that are very, very important to make sure that our materials look just the way that they should. So in the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and continue this discussion on the linear workflow inside of Maya and learn where gamma correction should be applied within our materials and where it shouldn't.